Internet, how's it going? Thanks so much for tuning in and for joining me for the very first episode of Jan's Patchwork Corner, in which I talk about how to get a synthesizer to make the sounds that you hear in your head. I'm Jan Morgenstern from Treeswift Audio, and a couple days ago I've posted a brief announcement video in which I go into a little bit more detail about the whole idea and concept behind this thing. So if you're interested in the what and how and why, then I recommend you check that out. The very brief version is that this is going to be a series of videos in which I show off synthesizer patches that I've created either for one of my commercial sound sets or for a music project, and break them down into their essential components for you and explain how everything works and fits together to achieve the sound that I wanted. So if you're interested at all in any aspect of synth programming or synth-based sound design, then do stick around, because I very much hope that there's going to be some interesting and useful info for you in here. And one more small thing that I'm also touching on in that announcement video is that for the time being, I'm going to do this in UHI Zebra 2, just because it kind of happens to be my personal natural habitat for this kind of synth work. But that being said, I am going to make an effort wherever it makes sense to keep things as generalized as possible and make explanations in a way that will hopefully make it easy for you to adapt them to whichever synth you might prefer to use. So even if you're not a Zebra user yourself, I hope that you're still going to be able to get something out of this. Alright, so I kind of made a promise to try and keep this intro as short as possible, so I'm going to try and stick to that, and let's jump right in. Enjoy! Okay, so for the first episode, I've picked a patch that is relatively straightforward. You can tell here that there's only a small handful of modules in the signal path. Of course, there's a little bit more going on over here in the modulator section, but still not too much rocket surgery. And this is a patch from my library, Zebra Elementals ISLA, available on treeswiftaudio.com. Use offer code QUILTMASTER for 10% off. That is called Bioluminescence, and this is what it sounds like. That's right, it's a synth pad. As far as pad sounds go, I would say that this is pretty firmly in the warm, fuzzy snuggle blanket category. It's a technical term. And straight off the bat, you can tell that there's a couple different layers at work here. So the whole thing is kind of resting on this foundation of this very soft and warm and muted, but still kind of wide and big sounding analog synth string sound. And then we have just a little bit more air in the upper mids, just as a little bit of a hazy background that's providing a little bit more interest and movement to the whole thing. And then, of course, on top of everything, we have this layer of aleatoric, which of course is a poser word for randomized, little, sparkly, tingly things that are kind of adding a little bit of an air of magic and fairy dust to the whole thing. Cool. So let's go over each of those elements in order. But I was thinking it's probably going to be more fun for you and for me if I don't just go through the finalized patch and rattle down the parameters, but instead try to recreate something from scratch that is similar to this, and probably will end up in the same ballpark. It's probably not going to end up sounding the exact same, but at least I can make use of all the techniques that I've used in here. So for now, let's get rid of this and call up our default init patch. So, of course, there's no hard and fast rule on how to approach a sound like this. But maybe I can tell you a little bit about my own preferences, because over time I've just noticed that I'm, like presumably all of us, that I'm kind of always gravitating to certain sets of qualities depending on what I'm after. And when it comes to this specific kind of warm and gooey filler sound, I've noticed that more often than not, I'm looking for something that will give me a certain kind of compactness in the frequency realm. And what I mean by that is that I like it when sounds like this, at least in their default state, will kind of focus and concentrate most of their sonic energy within a relatively narrow band of the frequency spectrum. Somewhere in the mid-range, if I can, I try to go a little bit easy on the lower mid-range, because that's a range that's kind of prone to clogging up first in a mix. Certainly stay out of the bass and sub-bass ranges. We've got no business down there. But also not extend all that far into the upper ranges. But at the same time, within that limited range, I want there a lot of things to be happening. I want to cram every single harmonic that I can into that range, and I want them all to be nice and big and present. Because I find that that leaves me with a sound that kind of gives me the feeling of energy and richness and vibrance without actually taking up all that much space in the spectrum and hence in a mix. Because at the end of the day, what is the pad sound supposed to do? It's kind of usually meant to stay in the background and kind of provide the harmonic backing from there and otherwise kind of flow around the more prominent parts in your arrangement, right? And of course, it will do that more successfully if it doesn't dominate or monopolize the spectrum. So that's kind of a convoluted way of saying that in a lot of cases, my go-to starting point for a sound like this will be an oscillator loaded up with something akin to a sawtooth wave, which I will then filter down more or less drastically. And I'm going to explain why that is in a moment. For now, let me just go ahead and set something like that up. And I won't have to do a whole lot because Zero's default init patch already gives us a single oscillator that's wired to our main output. Let me just get rid of the default transposition here real quick. And that oscillator comes preloaded with a sawtooth wave. So let me freeze this real quick. Cool. So as you might know, and as you can see here in the frequency plot, a sawtooth wave is kind of unique in that it has a whole lot of frequency content in its spectrum. And as a matter of fact, it has all the frequency content that you can possibly cram into a harmonic waveform. Or in other words, it has every single overtone in the natural harmonic series. And they're all forming this solid wall of harmonics that extends all the way to the top of the audible spectrum. So in other words, it's very, very brilliant. And that kind of makes it uniquely qualified to what I'm trying to do, which, remember, is to concentrate a lot of energy within a relatively narrow band in the spectrum. And there's also a second reason why I'm reaching for this one first. That might be a little bit more academic, so bear with me. Arguably, the gold standard for what a pad sound is supposed to do in the real world is a string ensemble, right? Meaning like a group of string players playing long notes in some kind of chordal arrangement, arco, meaning bowed, with or without dampers, usually with vibrato, in a room, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure that the idea of a synth pad wasn't even around until people started to very specifically try and recreate the sound of a string section with their synthesizers. And if you take a closer look at the kind of waveform that a bowed string will produce, you're going to find out that it's fairly close to a sawtooth wave. And that is because the way that the bow will interact with a string is that the sticky goo on the bow, which is called the rosin, will cling to the string and drag it sideways out of its resting position, which of course will increase the tension in the string until this tension becomes so large that it will overcome this dragging force of the bow. And at that moment, the string will in an instant slip from underneath the bow to the other side of its resting position, where it then will cling back to the rosin and the whole process begins anew. So in other words, you're getting this constant drag and slip motion that's happening a couple 100 times per second. And of course, if you translate that into a periodic change in air pressure, i.e. sound, then you're going to see that it's fairly close to a sawtooth wave. And of course, there's like a thousand other factors that make a string instrument sound like a string instrument, but at its core, that's how it produces its sound. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that if the characteristic sound of string instruments or ensembles factors into what you're trying to do, then you could do much worse than start from a point of a humble sawtooth wave. It's not humble. It's like the least humble of all the waveforms. Okay, so of course this is far too bright and far too brilliant for what we're trying to do, which of course is like a much warmer and smoother timbre. So next thing I'm going to do is feed this straight into a low pass filter to get rid of all that pesky brilliance. And for now, I'm just going to go ahead with Zebra's default 4-pole low pass filter. And I'm going to tune this so that around middle C, roughly, it will leave my first few harmonics relatively unaffected, but then give me this relatively steep fall off towards the upper end of the spectrum. And before I move on to the next steps, I want to make a few tweaks to our amplifier envelope, because right now it's very, very abrupt, and I just want that to be more in line with what you would expect from like a string or a pad sound like this. So I'm just gonna dial up our attack time a little bit to make that smoother. I'm gonna put our sustain level all the way to the top, get rid of our decay phase, and then just give us a little bit of a release phase. And those don't have to be the final values. It's just that will kind of make all the following steps a little bit more pleasant than if we stuck with that kind of rude organ-like response. Okay, so we're starting to get a little bit of a sense of where we're going sonically, but you're going to agree that this is still kind of a far cry from the lush and wide ensemble sound that we're looking for, right? And of course, the main reason for that is that there's no ensemble. We're still listening to a single oscillator per voice. So let's work on that. And on an analog synth or like a more traditional hardware synth, this might be the moment where you bring up a second oscillator into the mix, maybe even a third one, and you would tweak their tuning parameters slightly so that they're not all firing on the exact same frequency, but kind of evenly cover a little bit of a range around the actual target frequency of your note. Because that's kind of the essence of that characteristic ensemble sound, right? The fact that in the real world, tonal instruments will never be 100% in tune with each other. So since the rise of virtual analog synths and soft synths in the 90s, a lot of them have streamlined that process a little bit just because it's so ubiquitous. And a lot of them will give you kind of a shortcut function that will let you create internal copies of one and the same oscillator and then apply that kind of tuning spread to each of those copies automatically. And often that will be called something like Ensemble or Unison. Of course, Zebra can do that trick too, and here it's known as an oscillator stack. So Zebra gives me the option of turning a single oscillator into 2 or 4 or 11 copies of itself. And what do we do when a control goes up to 11? That's right. So right now it sounds weird because right now they are all firing at the exact same frequency. But as I start applying this tuning spread via the detune knob, you can tell how it brings up this movement in our sound, which will then eventually develop into that characteristic ensemble sound that we're looking for. So that's cool and fun, but it's also worth pointing out that there's kind of a point of diminishing returns with this kind of oscillator duplication. Like it's actually not all that often that I go all the way up to 11 in Zebra. For most of these applications, 4 voices will be plenty. And if you listen back to those options, so that's a single oscillator, that's 2, that's 4, and that's 11, you can tell how the jump from 2 to 4 voices is kind of much more dramatic and significant than the one from 4 to 11. And even if I were to add another 100 voices to this, it wouldn't necessarily leave me with like a thicker or more impressive sound. The main reason why I think that 11 might still be the right call in this scenario is that I'm not just after the increase in thickness and substance in the sound, but also after the added chaos that it brings up. Because if you're focusing to what's happening within our timbre now, you can tell that we now have all this kind of chaotic or semi-chaotic warble, right? And what you're hearing there is the effects of the beat frequencies that we've introduced by detuning our voices. So real quick, a beat frequency is a phenomenon that occurs when you have two frequencies that are very close to one another in the spectrum and of roughly comparable amplitudes. And what will happen is that these two frequencies start oscillating and changing between canceling each other out when they're mostly out of phase with one another and adding up to one another when they're mostly in phase. And this oscillation, this change between those two states occurs at the difference between their absolute frequencies. So in other words, if I have like a 400 hertz frequency and a 403 hertz frequency, and they're sounding at the same time, I will get this kind of pulsating motion and the sound will disappear and reappear at a frequency of 3 hertz. And you can imagine that if that happens with two frequencies, if you do that to every single harmonic in your sound, and you don't just add one copy to each of those, but actually 10 copies in the way that we're doing right now, then you're going to get a whole lot of that interaction. And that's exactly what's creating this kind of warble. And if I'm going to be honest with you, as long as I listen to the raw output of the oscillator, I don't find that effect all that pleasant or convincing. It's just it has like a certain roboticness to it. It's a little bit too periodic. It kind of gives away its origins in maths. The reason why I'm not so worried about that is that at a later stage, when we start looking into effects, we're going to explore some strategies to add some blur and kind of diffusion to our sound. And in my experience, at one of those points, these kinds of periodic movements and modulations become much more of an asset, because once you add enough diffusion to that, our ear becomes much less likely to actually, latch onto what exactly is happening and follow the exact motion of that modulation, but instead, is getting so much chaos that it's just left with a general feeling of vibrance and things happening within the sound. So for now, I'm perfectly happy with that. So the next thing you might be noticing if you're listening on headphones or decent stereo speakers is that our ensemble kind of seems a little bit huddled together in the middle of the stereo stage, right? And we're not yet getting the impression of listening to a larger ensemble that's actually filling the room. And the trick here is that, similarly to how we've been fanning out the exact frequencies of our voices, we can do the same with their stereo positions. And that is what the width control will do. With the idea being that if I turn that all the way down to 0, I'm now getting a mono signal out of my oscillator, because right now all our 11 voices are exactly in the middle of the stereo stage. And as I start tuning that up, or turning that up towards this maximum, you can tell how our sound is progressively becoming wider until we're getting this nice kind of cinerama effect. Not to rain on our parade here, but like with any control that's giving you this kind of instant gratification, there's always a little bit of a risk of overdoing it. For one thing, not every sound needs to fill out the entirety of your stereo stage. But maybe more importantly, if you try this with a smaller oscillator stack that only has 4 or maybe even 2 voices in it, you might be able to tell how it's now giving us something that doesn't even register as anything having an actual dimension to it. And instead, we're getting this weird and slightly disorienting kind of dual mono effect, where it is almost as if we're listening to two completely separate signals in the left and the right channel, and there's kind of nothing in between. So if I'm working with smaller stacks, I tend to go a little bit more conservatively on the width knob. The reason why it works in this case is that we have our 11 voices, and even if our first voice is hard print to the left channel and our last voice is hard print to the right channel, which is the case when I put this all the way to 100, we still have 9 more voices that are evenly filling out the rest of the stereo stage and kind of patching up any holes in between. So I feel like in our case, we can get away with cranking that all the way up. All right. So since we're on the subject of adding movement to our sound, the go-to way in which humans will do that is by playing vibrato, right? And I was mentioning it earlier, string players will play long notes with vibrato unless you specifically instruct them not to do that. And when strings play non-vibrato, then it kind of gives their sound a little bit of a peculiar quality. It's like very, very silvery and crystalline and almost eerie, which can be beautiful, but it's also very different from like the canonical string sounds that we all know and love. So it kind of makes sense for us to try and emulate that a little bit. And you can write master's thesis on the exact nature of vibrato in human like performances and its role in musical expression. But at the end of the day, when you break it down, it's first and foremost a periodic change in pitch, right? And that's something that we can work with, of course. In fact, any oscillator in Zebra already comes with its own vibrato control, and this is just a convenient shortcut. It's hardwired to take whatever LFO1 is doing and to apply it to your tuning up to a range of, I think, plus minus 50 cents when I crank it all the way up. So the way that I'm going to set this up is first I'm going to dial in some insane amount of vibrato, because that will make it much easier to tell what the LFO is actually doing. And then I'm going to switch the LFO to an absolute time scale, because it doesn't make much sense in our case to keep that in sync to our song tempo. And now I will try to figure out a setting, like a rate, that kind of sounds plausible to my ears as something that a human player would play, something like that. As far as the waveform is concerned, like the exact shape of that modulation, from the classic waveforms that you will find, like traditional LFO, the obvious candidates for this are a sine wave and a triangle wave. Both will generally do the job. A sine wave tends to create modulations that are a little bit more noticeable, just because the sine wave has these 2 points at its maximum and minimum, where it's kind of like the modulation comes to a standstill for a brief moment before it starts reversing its direction. And also statistically, the sine wave just spends more time in the extreme ends of its modulation range, whereas the triangle just keeps moving at a constant speed, which kind of tends to just be a little bit more subtle. On the other hand, if we're talking vibrato, the sine wave is a little bit closer to the actual pitch curve that you would see in a human vibrato. So kind of comes down to taste. But one other thing that comes in handy is the delay parameter. And what this will do is, if I turn that up, it means that the LFO won't start at its maximum amplitude towards the start of a note, but instead will slowly ramp up its amplitude, and therefore the modulation depth, or the depth of our vibrato, over the first couple 100 milliseconds, which again is closer to how a human would play vibrato. They rarely start going into a note with the full range of vibrato applied, but instead kind of sneak that in. So if I do that, you can tell how our note now starts fairly plain and kind of develops this vibrato over time, which I just find a little bit more organic. Okay, so now that I'm happy with that modulation, I'm just gonna dial this back to a depth that kind of sounds relatively natural. And just as a quick comparison, this is where we came from. And this is the whole thing with vibrato. So we just have another layer of relatively subtle movement within our sound. Now, it's kind of worth mentioning that what we're doing here is a little bit of a crappy approximation of how vibrato works in the real world, at least as far as ensembles are concerned. Because what we're doing is we're taking one single LFO and we're applying it in exactly the same manner to all the voices in our stack. And that, of course, is super not how things work in the real world, where if you have a room full of string players, of course, each of them is doing their own thing with vibrato. And instead of you being able to point out exactly what is happening to the pitch, you're once again just left with a general feeling of movement and vibrance in the sound. And it's a little bit hard for us to replicate that with this kind of setup because there's no way for us to apply independent modulation to the voices in our stack. There's a couple factors that kind of come to our help here. One is that we're working on a pad sound, and pads are generally not played in single notes, but in intervals and chords. And if I'm playing something like a triad, let's say, each of the 3 notes in my chord is getting its own version of LFO1. And while they're all running at the exact same rate and waveform and modulation depth, they're all starting at different points in time or at different points of their modulation waveform. So in other words, their phases are mixed up, which is already evening out this effect a little bit and giving us a more of a homogenized sound. And also, once again, this is another thing that gets much more tolerable once we start adding a little bit of blur and diffusion to our sound. So before we move on, real quick, I'm going to have to take a small step back and revisit the tuning of this filter. Because if you remember, I've been using notes from around the middle C area to dial in the timbre that I wanted, which is actually a little bit on the bright side still. And the issue is that if I move out of this range and into other ranges on the keyboard, to, let's say, 2 octaves below middle C, I'm now getting a vastly different output spectrum that has a lot more harmonics and is a lot more brilliant than what I'm expecting. And even worse, if I go into the other direction, I'm being left with barely anything at all. And what's causing this, of course, is that the filter's cutoff frequency is right now entirely static, meaning that it will just sit at the absolute frequency where we left it, no matter what we throw against the filter. And as I move into different parts of the keyboard, different ranges, I am shifting large chunks of our spectrum way into the filter's pass band below or into its stop band above. So the answer, of course, is to make the filter respond to and follow along with what I'm playing. And that is where the key follow parameter comes in. So this is a parameter that you're going to find on pretty much any synth filter that is meant to act on a per voice basis. And a value of 0 here in Zebra means that it won't touch the cutoff frequency at all. It's entirely static right now. And if I put that all the way up to 100, it means that the filter is now accurately following along with what I'm playing, meaning that if I go up an octave on the keyboard, I will also add exactly an octave to my cutoff frequency. So whenever I started making any adjustments here, I'm going to have to compensate for that, because it's also shifting the values in the middle range where I make my adjustments. So I'm just gonna dial this back and try to get back roughly to our starting point. And now it doesn't matter where on the keyboard I'm playing and in which register I'm playing, I'm always getting the exact same spectrum, or like the exact same relative overtone structure, which might or might not be what you want. Because the thing is that a lot of acoustic instruments actually do get more brilliant and do have a brighter timbre towards the lower lower end of their tonal range. That's certainly true for strings. If you take something like a violin playing on the G string in its lowest register, it has like a much more bright and rich and brilliant tone than as it's going upwards towards the higher strings and towards the upper limits of its range. So if we want to account for that, and in a lot of cases I do, because I just feel like it makes things feel a little bit more organic, then we can just back down a little bit on the key follow. In a lot of cases I'm going to end up somewhere in the 50 to 70 range. It's not an exact science unless you actually tune your filter for musical applications. And of course now I'm going to have to compensate for that again. That sounds about right. And now I should be getting like a slightly more powerful and rich sound towards the lower ends of the range, and a bit more of a subdued sound in the upper ranges. All right, so let's rejoin the main quest. The next thing that's bothering me here a little bit is that our timbre is still entirely static. We now have all these cool little micro movements going on within our sound on account of our detuning and our vibrato. But if we take a step back and try to get a feel for what exactly it's telling us over the course of a note, it's not much, right? Because if I trigger a note, I'm getting this exact spectrum, and it's just sitting there until the end of the note. And that, once again, is something that just rarely occurs in the real world. Like, for one thing, pretty much any kind of acoustic instrument will have some kind of timbral shift going on over the course of a note, at the very least in the first few moments after a note starts. But maybe more to the point, on an instrument that will let you do that, your winds, your brass, your strings, your voices, giving your notes and your phrases some kind of deliberate arc in terms of intensity is just what we call musical expression. And if that's entirely absent from a sound like this, then it just tends to sound a little bit flat and lifeless. So what I'm going to do to add a little bit of that expressiveness to our sound is I'm going to start modulating our filter cutoff over time, over the course of a note. I'm going to use a new envelope for that. And what I'm trying to achieve here is I want to give our notes a little bit of a bump towards their beginning. So when I trigger a note, I want the intensity or the brightness of our sound to relatively quickly ramp up and then hit a peak, and then more gradually settle down until it kind of comes to a rest on a plateau, where it will then remain for the rest of the note, and then again more gradually ramp down even further during the release phase. And we're just going to whip up an envelope that will roughly do that. For now, I'm just going to roughly copy our attack time from our amplifier envelope. The decay time I'm going to make a little bit longer than that. And for now, I'm just going to go with a sustain level of 50 and see how it works out. And our release time, I'm going to set a little bit longer than the release time of our amplifier envelope, just to make sure that things keep moving for the entirety of the release phase, or for as long as our sound is still audible. So what I want to avoid is our filter hitting its 0 point as the note is still ringing out. Okay, so I'm just going to turn up the modulation depth a little bit and have a listen. It's not too bad. And envelopes are unipolar modulators, so they happen within the positive range of the modulation range, which means that we're only adding to our cutoff frequency. And if we're working with a sustain level of 50, it means that once we're hitting the sustain phase of our envelope, we're still adding half our modulation depth to our cutoff value. So that would be 7. So in order to compensate for that and have us be at the original timbre that we started with during our sustain phase, I'm just gonna subtract 7 from this value, so that we're like back at our original timbre. So you can notice that the notes just have become a little bit more deliberate, right? Like, I mean this note. And this is also a good spot to start thinking about what we're doing with velocity. So far, we haven't done anything with it in our patch, and pretty much the only spot where it would have made any sense is if we had used it to scale our amplifier envelope, which of course would have made softer velocities cause an overall lower output level, which might sound intuitively right, but in my experience, rarely sounds all that convincing. And I think that has to do with the fact that for a lot of acoustic instruments, the absolute difference in their actual output level, as in like pure sound pressure that they're putting out between their soft and their loud dynamics, is often not quite as dramatic as you would expect. Of course, there's exceptions, but certainly with strings, if you have a violin playing piano and a violin playing the same thing forte and you compare the two, then the absolute difference in actual volume might be less than you would expect. And what's going to be much more dramatic and much more significant is the change in timbre, because of course the louder dynamic will have a sound that is a lot more brilliant and like will have a lot more harmonics and more complex overtone spectrum than the soft dynamic, which makes our shiny new filter envelope, in my opinion, the better candidate for scaling it along with the velocity. And if I start doing that, as you would expect, both the bump at the beginning as well as the overall brightness that we're landing on in the sustained phase will be much darker on softer dynamics now. And when I play harder, we're getting a more pronounced effect. And now that I have some control over the intensity of this expression, I can also safely go a little bit up with my modulation depth so that we're still getting like a perceivable expression on lower dynamics and a really pronounced effect on like the hardest or the loudest dynamics. I'm not going to go all the way to up to 100 with the scaling, because that would mean that on the lowest dynamics we're not getting any expression modulation at all anymore. So this feels about right. And of course there's a whole lot more that we can do with velocity. So Zebra also makes it very easy to use velocity to change other aspects of your envelope. What I often end up doing in my patches, especially in patches like this, I'm going to give them a little bit more of a snappier attack on higher velocities. That also can work well with the amplifier envelope. Okay, except that that's maybe a little bit too snappy, so I can maybe go with a lower or a slower attack time overall, so that I'm getting this like beautiful soft attack on the lowest dynamics and then a relatively, well, like almost aggressive, like snappy attack on higher dynamics. I can also stretch out the decay time of our filter envelope a little bit, just so on louder dynamics, this bump in the beginning will be stretched out a little bit and more pronounced. I think overall we could maybe go with a slightly longer release time overall. And it's not too bad. Here, let's back off a little bit. Okay, that works for now. Honestly, it's a little bit of a bottomless pit. There's like I haven't even gotten into the exact shape of our envelopes, because of course Zebra also lets you decide whether you want to have linear versus convex versus concave segments, and that can also have a drastic effect on the end result. Honestly, I could spend like another hour fine-tuning this stuff, but I also feel like this is a part of synth programming where I kind of feel like the best advice that I have to offer is, I don't know, twiddle the knobs until it sounds right. Like, what do you want from me? So seeing that we're running a little bit long, let's call this perfectly serviceable and move on. So now that we've started using our filter to add expression to our sound, why not go one step further and give even more control over that to the user so that they can, perform their own arcs over the course of a note or a musical phrase, and also to give them a way to selectively add back some of the brilliance that we've been filtering out of the sound, for those moments when they actually do want our sound to take the center stage and become the point of focus in their mix. And that's easy enough to do. Of course, we can just take whichever continuous controller is in reach of the user. Mod wheel is kind of an obvious choice. And just slap that on top of the cutoff modulation that's already in place. And I'm going to set up this modulation by putting my mod wheel all the way to the top and then adjusting the modulation depth to define the upper endpoint of that modulation range. Let's say somewhere to thereabouts. And now, of course, I have real-time control over my brilliance. Neat. I don't know about you, but I feel like, especially towards the upper third of that modulation range, we are really getting clobbered with harmonics, right? It's really like aggressive. And I mean, of course it is, because the raw output from our oscillator sounds like that. But I kind of feel like it's not really in line with the intent of this patch. Like even with the mod wheel all the way at the top, I still want it to sound like a warm and soft synth pad, just with more brilliance and not like this, balls to the wall EDM monster. And of course I could just back off a little bit on my modulation depth and just not open the filter quite as far, but now it kind of just feels limited, right? You can tell that the filter is never opening up all the way. So what I'm going to try and do instead is tame our oscillator a little bit and try to convince it not to put out all that much brightness in the first place. But at the same time, I do want to retain what it's doing for us in the low end of the spectrum. Kind of that density in the first couple harmonics. That's cool. I want to keep that because that's what's giving us this feeling of spectral compactness that I was talking about earlier. I just wanted to have like a more gentle roll off towards the higher frequencies. And there's a variety of ways in which I can try and do that. Like an obvious one would be to start messing with the waveform itself and getting rid of this abrupt skip in amplitude, which is always where the high frequency content is sitting, and basically nudge it a little bit more towards a triangle wave. Something like that maybe. And that's doing the trick-ish. It's a little bit hard to control the exact shape of this roll-off, and it's also giving us these weird ripples across our spectrum that are a result of the fact that the overtone spectrum or the overtone structure of a triangle wave is very different than that of a sawtooth wave. So, I could also Zebra has these nifty, I think, spectral effects, they call them. Those are basically little effects modules that you can strap on top of any oscillator, and that will let you warp and twist the waveform or the spectrum of whatever's happening inside the oscillator in a variety of different ways. And one of those modules is just called Brilliance, and it's straight up gives me like a control that will just let me adjust the amount of brilliance that I want to get from that oscillator. In this case, I want to go with a slightly different approach, mostly because I wanted to show it off, because I think it's pretty nifty and I keep coming back to it. So Zebra's oscillators have a variety of different modes when it comes to how you can define the kind of output that you want to get from them. And the principal difference between those modes is whether you're working in the time domain, which will let you work on waveforms, or in the frequency domain, which will let you work on spectrums, spectrae, one of those. And as you can guess, in its default state, we're in the time domain, and we can just straight up construct the kind of waveform that we want out of line and curve segments. And that's cool. We can easily set up like little wavetables and do like geometric morphing across those. And that's all nifty. But I'm going to switch over to one of the spectral modes. And the way this works is it's giving me this kind of canvas that I can paint on. And I can use this canvas to define the kind of harmonic spectrum that I want to get out of the oscillator. And if we have a closer look at that, you can see that I'm painting these bars. And the idea here is that each of these bars corresponds to the amplitude of a natural harmonic of my sound. Or in mathematical terms, if you're so inclined, an integer multiple of my fundamental frequency of my note. So in other words, we've now turned Zebra into an additive synthesizer. And the very first bar lets me control the amplitude of my fundamental, and then the one next to it will let me control the amplitude of the first overtone, which is the octave above the fundamental, and then we have the second overtone, which is the fifth above the octave, and so on, up to a maximum of 128 partials. And one more thing to be aware of is that each of these bars at the maximum of their value represents half the amplitude of the bar to the left of it. So in other words, you're getting this built-in 6 dB fall off as you go from one harmonic to the next, which might sound familiar to you if you're familiar with the spectrum of the sawtooth wave, because that is the exact relationship that you get in that spectrum as you go from one harmonic to the next. What that means is that if we want to go back to where we're coming from and reconstruct our original sawtooth, all we have to do is basically give it like a straight solid wall of harmonics, and we're exactly where we came from. But of course, we don't want to be there. Instead, I was thinking of something that might look more like this or so. Maybe even a little bit. So now I have a kind of pre-low pass filtered sawtooth, right? And to be honest, I could have arrived at roughly the same results in a variety of other ways. It's just, I think what makes this mode interesting to me is that it doesn't stop there, of course, because I can just keep experimenting with every partial of my tone. And oftentimes I will just, experiment. And you can tell that it doesn't really matter a lot what I do. I can just randomly paint in some valleys, some peaks, maybe some resonances. And all of that kind of adds to the character of our wave and kind of makes it more interesting than the plain sawtooth that we've had before. And I can pull off like nifty tricks, like for instance, I could decide to emphasize only the even-numbered harmonics, and that will give us almost the impression of a super octave, almost as if we had a second oscillator that was also sounding an octave above, and whichever floats your boat. One trick that I'm actually using this for in the original patch is that it also makes it very easy to slightly taper off the lower end of the spectrum. And that's a trick I use once in a while to just, make the sound a little bit slimmer towards the lower mid-range, because I feel like that kind of adds to the band-limited feel that I want for this kind of sound, and compresses the energy even more into the mid-range, and kind of makes the sound a little bit easier to handle in that region. A little bit of a bump here. That doesn't sound too bad. And just for comparison, this is where we came from. And this is where we are right now. I think that's a marked improvement for what we're trying to do. And if we go back to our original setup now, I'm gonna go back up with the modulation depth here, and that's much closer to what I had in mind. Now we're not getting, this all-out assault when we open the filter. So one more thing, there's always going to be one more thing. When I listen to this thing, like this new setup, I'm kind of getting second thoughts on whether this specific kind of filter is really the most optimal choice for what we're trying to do. So any kind of filter will do a whole lot of different things to your signal, even beyond its obvious core function, which of course is to carve out certain sections of the spectrum. And that is why you can have two different filters sound wildly different from one another, even if they share the same base characteristics as far as their type and their slope go. They can have differences in the exact shapes of their frequency responses. They could be handling resonance in a different way. They could be adding their own kinds of distortion or noise. And maybe most importantly, they can differ in how they treat the phase relationship in your signal. Because any filter, at least of the kind that you're going to encounter in a synth, will mess to some extent with the phases in your signal, meaning that it will shove around the waveforms of your frequencies in time by varying degrees, depending on where those frequencies are in relationship to the filter's cutoff point, which also makes that effect easier to spot as long as the filter is moving, because then it will continuously change those phase relationships. And I couldn't tell you exactly what this filter is specifically doing without measuring it. But what I can say is that to my ears, it's a little bit bitey. Like even with its resonance turned all the way down, it seems to be calling a lot of attention to its working point. And I think I would prefer something that gives me a bit of a smoother and gentler response that doesn't put that much of a spotlight on the filtering process itself. Now, this is a 4-pole low-pass filter, which means that we have a relatively steep cutoff slope. We're getting like a level attenuation of 24 decibels as we go from one octave to the next in the spectrum. And I could try a filter that just has a less steep response, like say a 2-pole low pass that only gives us 12 dB of attenuation from one octave to the next. And I would have to compensate a little bit for the fact that this is just bleeding through a lot more high frequency content by nature. And this is a little bit smoother, but to be honest, I kind of liked what the 4-pole was doing, especially with the mod wheel all the way down, which was really, it kind of really cuts down our sound to its most essential part, which is this awesome warm ball of fluff in the lowermost part of the spectrum. So even if we stick with the 4-pole low pass, fortunately, Zebra gives us a whole list of different models to choose from. And I'm going to go straight ahead to one of my personal favorites, which is the vintage model. So as long as the filter is mostly static, you might not hear all that much of a difference, but once I start moving it, you might hear that this is a very different sound. Just like to my ears, it's much more gentle and less obtrusive and kind of sounds just more natural. This filter also has a couple other interesting properties. It's very sensitive to input level to the point where even if I keep the overdrive control untouched, you can already tell that it adds a little bit of grunge to our signal. I would have to turn down our oscillator to get rid of that. If I deliberately kick it into overdrive, it starts bringing up like very obvious saturation in our sound, which can be cool in the right dose if the sound that you're working on calls for it. I think I added a little bit of that in the original patch. Unfortunately, that thing is also prone to creating those super low frequency artifacts in the spectrum. I believe what we're seeing there is actually the beat frequencies from our detuned oscillator stack that get crazily amplified and distorted. So, of course, we super don't want that in our sound, and the quote-unquote elegant way of getting rid of that would be to follow up our main filter with a high-pass filter and then keeping that tuned so that its cutoff point will always be slightly below the fundamental frequency of our note. The quick and dirty way to handle that is just to strap an EQ across our master bus and using its lowest band, which nominally is a shelving filter, but once I make its slope steep enough, can act as a makeshift low cut, and just use that to get rid of anything below, 100 hertz or something in our sound, because there's not going to be anything there that we want anyway. Cool. So, yeah, I'm going to go easy on the overdrive because a little bit of that goes a long way. That's not too bad. Maybe we're still a little bit on the bright side overall. I'm gonna pull this down just a tad. Not too bad. Okay. There's one more thing that I forgot to mention earlier. When you're using oscillator stacks, like we are, then the number of internally duplicated voices per oscillator will count towards the total number of voices that your patch will consume out of Zebra's pool of available voices, which can then run out fairly quickly, which you can tell by these ugly cut-off release trails that happen because Zebra has to recycle voices that are still sounding much quicker than it should. So if you're using that feature and expect your patch to be played in any kind of serious polyphonic fashion, then put the size of that voice pool up to many, and that should get rid of the problem. I think we're still overall a little bit on the bright side, right? I think I would go a bit darker by default. We compensate for the loss of level that the filter is giving us. Yeah, that's nice. And other than that, I think we're in a pretty good place. I think I'm fairly happy with those results. And more to the point, I think we're getting towards the limit of how much it makes sense to talk about these two modules. So why don't we call it a wrap on the synthesis portion of our first layer and start thinking about what else this patch might need. Hey, hi, it's full screen me from before. So here's the thing. My original plan was to try and get through the entirety of this patch in one go, but I don't know if you've noticed, I get a little bit chatty with this stuff. So I think what happened there is that I kind of fell into the trap of thinking, well, this is a fairly basic patch, so let's get into real detail on all those basics to put a little bit of meat on this episode, which kind of led to me talking for an hour about an oscillator and a filter. I hope I didn't bore you. I hope there was still some useful info in there. I'm probably going to have to adopt a little bit of a different pace for future episodes because things are bound to get more complex than this. But for now, I'm also kind of in it, and I will not go back to the beginning to re-record everything. So I think what makes the most sense is that we split this one up into a multi-parter, so that in the next episode, we're going to wrap up the first layer, then talk about effects, take care of the second layer, and then probably also move the third layer into its own episode. We'll see. Which, of course, brings us to the end of this here first episode. Folks, if you're still watching, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this. If you have any kind of feedback, questions, comments, suggestions, if you would like me to talk about anything in particular, cover any specific technique in future episodes, do let me know in the comments below. You can find this and all future episodes on my soundware labels website, treeswiftaudio.com, which of course is also where you can get my sound sets. Once again, that offer code is QuiltMaster. You can find out about my music and my general whereabouts on janmorgenstern.com. You can follow me on Twitter, if Twitter is still around by the time this comes out. You can find me at Wavecaster there. And other than that, hey, if you like this and would like to see more of it in the future, then you know the drill, right? Like, rate, share, subscribe, smash your buttons, I don't know, re-blog, go vote, live your best life. And see you around for the next episode of Jan's Patchwork Corner. Until then, I'm Jan Morgenstern. Thanks for watching. Have a good one. Bye-bye.